Farim fáidir oversteach a chuirde chu go Blúiríní Béaloidis an podtréidir a chud cnúsach beidir is air and seo glas in the whole school of Blúiríní. Ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome along to another edition of Folklore Fragments, the podcast from the National Folklore Collection here in University College Dublin, where myself, Jonny Dillon,
and myself, Claire Doohan,
shall act as your obliging hosts for the next hour or so, discussing aspects of our traditional cultural inheritance with a mixture of archival recordings, old books and manuscripts here in the collection, and the odd lie thrown into for good measure.
Never, Jonny, never.
No, plenty of lies.
No fake news here.
Tissue of lies, the whole thing. Now, in our previous instalment, we explored the look of the house and that symbolic aspects of our traditional architecture in general. And in today's instalment, we shall gather up our scythes and sickles, leave our humble abodes behind and travel out into the fields in order to discuss the harvest in Irish tradition. So in the course of today's discussion, we'll look at hilltop dances, contests of athletics and strength, and we'll be suitably scandalised by naked horse rides through lakes and into the sea, before looking at the idea of the spirit of the corn, or of the crops more generally, and specifically at the last sheaf or bundle of corn cut from the harvest and how this is symbolised, which is an item that was held in symbolic value for our forebears in Ireland and further afield across much of Europe. So for many of us nowadays was the summer, the height of the summer is a time of holidays and lounging about in good weather and so on. But strangely, the period that marked just prior to the arrival of the harvest was known as Hungry July, where the year's crops were at their lowest. And I suppose the day that we'll start to look at will be the 1st of August, which is Lammas or Lunas, one of the quarter days in Irish tradition, and some of the celebrations around that. But the idea, I suppose, that just before that, there was this period of hardship where people had next to nothing left in their stores, basically.
From the previous harvest.
From the previous harvest, yeah. And that there's a quote that I was reading from the Dublin University magazine, published in 1841, which I thought was kind of humorous in a bad way. It says, Monday, this is from Letters from the Coast of County Clare, and the author describes a fine summer's day. They say, a stranger travelling through Ireland in the summer season is often surprised at the plea put forward to excite his compassion and obtain alms, when perhaps on a lovely afternoon, when the sun shines bright, the air is balmy, and all creation revels in enjoyment and plenty, a group of beggars comes up to his carriage with, then, your honour, won't you feel for us this hard summer's day? Won't you give us something this hard, cruel summer's day? A lovely, horrible summer's day.
Isn't it really July. Such a contrast?
Yeah, strange. Yeah, you wouldn't have particularly thought about it. But the last Sunday in July typically was the day that marked the arrival of the harvest in Irish tradition. And that was a day that was met with kind of enormous celebrations. Although the festival itself of Lunas occurs on the 1st of August, but the date was generally moved, I suppose, kind of in accordance with its movement to kind of Christian tradition, that it became the last Sunday in July, and that was Garland Sunday, and that was a period of great celebration, revelry, and enjoyment, as we'll see from different instances around the country.
And it's quite a practical thing from what we've been reading, isn't it, to celebrate on a Sunday as opposed to sacrificing a working day?
Yes, that's a good point, actually. The day when everyone's free of the obligations and responsibilities of work,
and especially with the kind of the labour-intensive nature of the harvest, you're going to need all boots on the ground.
Everything that was about to begin. And there was there were loads of different names as well for Garland Sunday: Big Sunday, Rock Sunday, Height Sunday, Mountain Sunday, Frohan Sunday. Frohanberry is another part of Garland Sunday celebrations and observations.
Again, with that kind of theme of abundance of not just the crops but the fruits and you name it.
Yeah, there was the kind of this is when new potatoes were dug as well. It's like the kind of, as we call the title of today's podcast, the threshold of abundance. This is where kind of, I suppose, people's stores would return back in, and they were celebrating basically the country over.
And in terms of the names, the wonderful book actually, which we'd recommend, that if even if you can't buy it because it's a weighty tome, it's The Festival of Lunas by Maya McNeill, who was not one of our colleagues but one of our predecessors here who worked with the Irish Folklore Commission, and she was given her doctorate for it, wasn't she?
It's an amazing book, it really is. Yeah,
it's huge. It's nearly 700 pages of everything you could possibly wonder about the Festival of Lunas, customs, traditions, linking it to customs and antiquity, and she really cleverly tries to analyse the survivals of the Festival of Lunas as they would have known it in the 30s and 40s, and that has kind of survived into our period, to see what's actually authentic with the ancient festival. So for archaeologists, for historians, for folklorists, it's really valuable even just to dip in and out of it.
Even, I suppose, actually, it's worth explaining, I suppose, the idea of like Lúnasa as a quarter day. Again, a day that marks, we talked about May Day folklore as a kind of another one of the quarter day traditions, where these are kind of access points, hinges upon which the year turns. So Lúnasa brings in the harvest season. It ushers in at the beginning of a new season and then the end of an old one, obviously. And then it was named after, I suppose, initially we had the pre-Christian pagan sun god Lugh of Ada, who had other kind of cults to him across Britain and Europe. Leon is named after Lugh.
That's true. We've got Leon, Loudon in France, Leiden in the Netherlands, and Louth in Ireland.
And you had in Wales and Clw Giffes or something like that, who's the same figure. But they even the Irish, they have the Lugh in Lúnasa refers to the god, and then Nasa is to a gathering, a celebration kind of. And it was Lugh, this deity, who established the fair at Talton in County Meath. That's true. Where you'd have all these assemblies of kind of kings and nobles and merchants and all these kind of contests and athletics and general celebrations as well. So this is the kind of the older pre-Christian, I guess, celebration linked to this deity that many people wouldn't necessarily be aware of when you speak the word of Lúnasa, the month of Lúnasa.
No, not anymore.
That it refers to a sun god, essentially, and the celebrations that he duly established.
But what's wonderful, actually, I don't know if you've heard about this, in Talton, which again just ties in with that assembly, is actually being re-established. Well, the title certainly. Recently, they're going to have competitions between the Connemara Gaeltarts and the Donegal Gweedore Gaeltarts, which is lovely to see.
What are they going to be competing at?
They're going to be doing, I think there's sports, and they're doing literature and art. A wonderful idea.
And just the Gaeltachts?
I believe so to begin with, but then they have great plans to incorporate the rest of the country.
Because didn't they in the 30s yes. They had at the fairs. Did we see the newspaper cutting?
That's
here?
right.
Was it the two guys standing in the old all those kind of old get-up with the wolfhounds and stuff like this at these competitions?
Was that right? Kind of that nationalistic theme back in the day.
Didn't they as well have like football competitions where kind of quote unquote France would play Ireland, but France was just a team of Irish lads called France for the purposes of the day.
I didn't realise that.
Or South Africa won the such and such race or something, but there was, I don't think there were anyone except Irish people. Yeah. But I had this international. I could be totally wrong.
Is this fake news now, Jonny?
It could be. Yeah, just keeping some disinformation going there. But I remember only lately looking at that, the Tailtown or the Éanach Tailtown, whatever, in the 1930s. Yeah.
But it's a thread that runs.
It is
through to 2017, which is wonderful.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
Continues.
But there's a description here, or a kind of piece I dug out from the archive, one of these tapes, and Michael Walsh recorded in County Offaly, and he's describing Garland Sunday, which might be a nice kind of preamble for some of the other accounts that we can have and just themes that we describe. Yeah.
They gave me a great description of Garland Sunday. The last Sunday in July.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear it called Garland Sunday?
Sure, we always heard it. When I was a youngster living up there, often run up with my father, but you see, they'd come out from the Queen's County walk in that time from over the mountain. The middle of the mountain all along the ways Offaly and Laois. Well, they'd come out in droves, boys and girls, and bring melodians with them. And then there was a place down near the foot of the mountain, but not at the foot, a great big place they called the Cruchawan.
Yeah.
Well, there could be 5 or 6 or 10 sets at the one time dancing and that. Dancing. They'd come up from Bore and there'd be sidecars, and there'd be one selling gingerbread and lemonade and ginger cakes and minerals, and I think could sell stout too.
Yeah, all the quiet.
Yeah. Well, then that'd be over Garland Sunday.
That'll do. Bottles of stout and all. That'd be out.
Before the harvest.
Before the harvest, yeah.
Absolutely.
But that was the general kind of, I suppose, the theme, despite all the different kind of names in the day, they all generally revolved, as Mick Walster says, that there'd be droves would come out, there'd be melodians, there'd be kind of music being played. They had these outdoor gatherings of youths who would climb to the summits of their local hills and kind of hilltops and mountains there to just have the crack for the day, basically.
And actually this is, because that kind of comes within a few categories, which I suppose for the sake of being thorough and giving a clear understanding, it could be divided. So we've got this great spirit celebration associated with the beginning of the harvest, and these would often, as you said, be celebrated by assemblies at these traditional sites, and those sites are natural features of three types, I suppose. So heights, springs or wells, and then lake shores or river shores, and then as well as that, later the idea of fairs would tie in with Lunacy. So shall we have a quick cursory glance over the four of them and see what interesting facts we've unearthed?
Yes, indeed.
You're just dying to get to the skinny dipping at the lake, aren't you?
Yeah, well, that's it, yeah.
We'll work up to that. So the festive assemblies, again tying in with that idea, as you said there, of this joyous approach to celebrating the harvest and this threshold of plenty and the arrival of this new abundance when people were suffering for so long with the shortage of food and resources. And Moy McNeill actually identifies 78 hills across Ireland through the materials here in the archive and through our own research. So we had 9 hills in Connacht, or 9 mountains or hills, 15 in Leinster, 15 in Munster, and then 39 in Ulster. So we see kind of a significant rise. And one of them, as an example, I'll show my bias here because I did not know about this, and it just shows me how little we listened to our forebears really, when we should have listened more. But in Gweedore there was a mountain just to the north of Gweedore called Carnthruna, and on Doohan the Rihog, which was Bilberry Sunday, they used to, and again it was the young people, because given the nature of the height, you're going to almost exclude a certain demographic of the very young and the very old who can't obviously make the climb. So after the midday meal, the lady who's the respondent was saying that they would dress in their Sunday best and climb Carnthruna and spend the day there collecting bilberries, singing, dancing, courting. And then what's lovely, at the end of the day, or during the course of the day, the men would actually make little bracelets of the bilberries for the girls. But what's interesting, and what Moy McNeill couldn't explain, was that they always left the bracelets on the mountain. They never brought them home.
Okay.
Which is, I don't know whether there's any significance. But again, her description's so vivid and poignant, but it gives that idea of climbing to the heights on, and again, as you were saying, there's this kind of variation between the last July, or the last Sunday in July, and the first Sunday in August, depending on which was closest to the 1st of August.
Yeah.
So in Donegal, they seem to be the first Sunday of August, but the examples for the final Garland Sunday, the final Sunday in July, are the same. Climbing the heights to just enjoy their company
Engage in
and
revelry and sport,
absolutely.
yeah. And what would be a kind of rare time to do so over the whole community as well. That's lovely about the little bracelets. I'd never heard about that.
No, and
Lovely.
I've not seen it in any of the other recollections. But again, it's that idea of, whereas all the other quarter day celebrations or festivals in Ireland, McNeill makes a really interesting point that they're all a little bittersweet sometimes. So you've got the May Festival, which can involve festivities, but you've got
large doses of paranoia as well.
Exactly. And then you've got, say, Halloween, you've got the festivity, but you've got this
sinister aspect to it, yeah.
of the undead. Whereas singularly, when we look at August and Garland Sunday, it just seems to be joyous and a sense of celebration, untinged with sadness.
Yeah, for once.
For once in Ireland.
There's a piece here of Mick Walsh again, and he's talking, because you mentioned collecting frothenberries and bilberries and so on, and that was a huge part of Garland Sunday celebrations. Yeah. And there's a brief bit of the recording here where he describes that and climbing around all these mountain streams. It's kind of idyllic, lovely scene, really.
I used to be picking frachens, mate.
Oh, the frachens, Dean. A lot of them want to go up, you see, to pick the frachens or to the top. They think they could walk to the top, but get tired before they'd be halfway. But if you kept going, you would get to the top and could see down into Mount Rat and away off Leash, as far as you could see, towns, houses. Now, on the other side was down something the same, but seemingly not as high from that side as this side. Well, then there'd be mountain streams. There'd be what they call a slough. Do you know how a slough is?
I do, yeah.
An old slough. Well, it would be about 2 perch or 3 wide to look from one side to the other.
Yeah.
But you have to go down in a slope down a long ways. Oh, it would be 25 or 30 feet. And there's a grand mountain stream running down in the bottom. But down the sides, there's frozen trees, and you could date all the day of them. There's something like black currants, but bigger and fairly sweet. Could go down, but the time you're going to get down, drink all the water you wanted out, steaming up the other side.
They have the alarm clock going in the background there.
As you can hear, very authentic.
It's quite a kind of I don't know. It's a pleasant scene. It's quite innocent in its way as well. As describing, you can go down the side of this steep mountain slope and eat all the berries you like, and then drink all the water you want, and climb up the other side and eat all the berries. It's lovely. And then you can imagine as well a Sunday. In the previous piece, he describes, that there could be hundreds of people from parishes all over surrounding this mountain in the local district, this local hill, and they're all just ascending to the top of it. So there'd be people you'd never met or wouldn't know. There'd be a huge kind of social outing and music and all that sort of stuff as well. And
it's true of the entire harvest tradition, though, this sense of the communal, not only in celebrating it, but also in reaping the harvest and the actual work involved of neighbours coming together, families, different parishes, a huge network of support and camaraderie and, I suppose, cooperation, which was necessary. Yeah,
I mean, even from the very start, we said you have these huge groups, kind of celebrations, or particularly for young people, and then you have the work of the harvest itself, which involves the kind of the mehel, the whole kind of cooperative labour in the community, and then even the harvest home is the kind of party to finish the harvest, where people are going to come round to the house, whatever. But yeah, these kind of ascending to hilltops, and specifically they leave it as a young person's kind of festival, something quite joyous about the kind of the whole theme to these kind of celebrations is quite joyful and innocent. He's describing kind of ginger cake and stuff as well being sold in bottles of stout and so on. So it sounds like a very pleasant gathering altogether.
And just before we started, we were chatting about that quote that the festival was enjoyed most by the young, vigorous and high-spirited, by those for whom life seemed about to offer the most fruitful joys. Yeah. Which is, as we were saying, is that metaphor, isn't it, of youth about to enjoy the fruits of life, hopefully, of what was coming. But then the harvest that was about to arrive as well, which is just a lovely idea to think about.
It is. It's quite beautiful, really, and just even that idea of kind of vigor and strength and joy of youth, and kind of just celebrating itself basically up on this kind of on these mountaintops, on these hills, whatever. It's a kind of a lovely idea. There's another section here. It's from Henry Morris, and he's talking about this is in features. It's an article he published describing features common to Garland Sunday or Lunas, harvest celebrations in Ireland and in Scotland, in the Isle of Man and other places. But he says people go on the first of Sunday in August to fairy places. This is very general in Ireland, that Sunday being called Garland Sunday, but the present generation does not know what these pilgrimages on this Sunday have anything to do with fairies. So that's a kind of not a particularly common even idea that you find that you're going to supernatural places, but perhaps that you are going to places of a certain kind of import, or that these landscapes have a certain kind of ideas attached to them, maybe even that this wasn't a kind of commonly done thing. I mean, there are certain even ideas of kind of holy mountains and so on as well, really. The most common example, did you know about Garland Sunday growing up at all?
It's funny, we don't use the term Garland Sunday in Donegal. We hadn't heard it. Even reading up on it, it seems to be kind of is it an English and Scottish settler influence?
The word, the word Garland means kind of posy of flowers. It's an English kind of word, but it also more generally just means, or can refer to, a party in general. True. So that's the kind of the context in which it was generally used. But I didn't remember hearing about it when I was growing up. But there are an enormous amount of people in Ireland who would know Garland Sunday very well as Reek Sunday. True. Or Donach na Cruche, where they go up Croagh Patrick in County Mayo, and something upwards of 20,000 pilgrims, I think, climb that now. And that's where you see an example it's the older kind of pre-Christian harvest, the celebration of welcoming the harvest in has kind of, it's made the jump into a kind of Christianized context, albeit a kind of apocryphal folk religious expression, where there are these pilgrimages up to the top of this mountain, and then that gets kind of sanctioned by the official church. So there's a church built on top of Croagh Patrick now. True. And on this day, you could have 20,000 or more pilgrims ascending to the top. Some of them, these devotees, in their bare feet, some of them climbing on their knees and doing rounds of prayers and so on, as they climb up this mountain. So you have a very kind of different tone or kind of feeling to this particular kind of celebration as they're climbing the mountaintops. But it's from that same idea of ascending to different heights. And yet then there are other kind of sacred mountains, or what would have been sacred mountains, that didn't make the jump. So there's evidence to suggest that the mountain just where I kind of grew up at the bottom of, essentially, the Sugarloaf in North County Wicklow, that there's a kind of sacred landscape around that in parts of County Dublin and in Wicklow of burial mounds or kind of archaeological sites and tombs that have the mountain in their sight in certain directions, and then even around the mountain itself, like Crowpatrick does. That as you stand around it, looking at it, there might be certain areas from a tomb. You can see the mountain here, and the sun sets or rises out of it at a certain time or whatever of the year. But that the Sugarloaf and other places didn't make the jump, so they didn't make the jump into kind of Christian tradition, and they kind of been any religious or something import has been kind of been dropped or abandoned from them.
I knew it. You were all pagans. I knew it the minute I saw you, Jonny.
A heathen. Yeah, that's it. But yeah, that aspect of kind of celebration, but then also the kind of the aspect of pilgrimage and ritual and prayer and visiting even graveyards or visiting holy wells and that sort of stuff is common. And then leaving posies of flowers on hilltops or at wells, or that sort of thing was kind of common as well. But yeah, apart from, I suppose mountains are the more generally well known, but visiting wells and that idea of pilgrimage and prayer was interesting. However, so actually there's just a curious kind of quote in this regard, just describing the kind of the Christianized sense of what we just when we talk about Crowpatrick and these pilgrimages. There's a piece here from the Isle of Man in the 19th century, and this is where it's the opposite, where the church are describing these kind of awful practices of people climbing mountaintops on Garland Sunday. Absolutely disgraceful. And the quote goes as follows. It says, "The curate and wardens represent to the court that there is a superstitious and wicked custom which is yearly continued and practised in this and neighbouring parishes by many young people, and some of riper years, Claire, going to the top of Snaefell Mountain on the first Sunday in August, where, as they are informed, they behave themselves very rudely and indecently for the greater part of the day. Therefore they crave that the Reverend Court may be pleased to order what method must be taken to put a stop to this profane custom for the future." And then it carries on to say that the court, in consequence of this order, ordained that publication be made yearly on the 2 last Sundays in July by the minister for the time being after the Nicene Creed, that whoever shall be found to profane the Lord's day after this wicked and superstitious manner shall be proceeded against with severe ecclesiastical censures, and the minister and wardens are hereby required to do their utmost in discovering the persons guilty in this particular and to make presentment thereof. There you are. Don't profane the Sabbath and the Isle of Man. Don't climb these mountains on Garland Sunday, and don't behave very rudely and decently for the greater part of the day, whether young or riper in years.
I don't know why you keep looking at me when you say riper years.
Well, Claire, no such thing. It's in the context of the harvest alone.
But is that idea of the strictures of the law, as we see in so much of
that's
folk
a good
tradition,
point,
isn't it?
Yeah.
That it's always this kind of authority or the state or the church that seems to impose these structures and frameworks and tries to kind of deaden down.
I mean, I think I don't think it'd be. I don't think it would be. I don't know, hyperbole or something to say that I think that the Catholic Church in Ireland would be, or the Church in general would have been responsible for the kind of quashing and ending of many different aspects of traditional customs that were carried on from pattern days and those kind of feast observances to wake games and so on and so forth. But that's a thing that you see more broadly, I suppose, the tension with aspects of the state as well. We have other instances here that we can go through, but where time and again there's some sort of there's a conflict between, like I said, the powers that be, or the court, or the ministers, or officialdom in some sense, and then these grotesque and rude practices of the peasantry, whatever, they need to be kind of immediately squashed and destroyed.
And one thing they looked very unfavourably on was naked swimming.
They were not fond of naked swimming.
No, can't understand why.
Which is part of the Garland Sunday or Lunacy celebrations in northwestern Europe.
Yes, very true. Shall we give a little example?
Yes.
Because I think it's fascinating. So, as we were discussing the mountaintop assemblies and kind of what we would call the patron pilgrimages as well with Crowpatrick, we also then come to lake shores and river shores where assemblies would be very common. So my McNeil again has 13 examples that she lists in detail, and we've got them from Meath, Westmeath, Tyrone, Cavan, Galway, Mayo, and it was common at these assemblies where kind of communities gathered kind of on lake shores and riversides to drive horses and cattle into the water to cleanse them and protect their health for the coming year. And men would often ride the horses naked into the river for some reason, but almost maybe in a sense to cleanse themselves as well as the horse. Would that be true?
Perhaps.
You never
Yeah.
know.
It's interesting. It's like the kind of an inverse of the May Day, driving the cattle and livestock through the fires, isn't it?
It's interesting. That's
driving
true.
into the water.
Because it's one of those things that's apparently, according to the kind of academic writing on it, that it's most suggestive of a more ancient ritual than any of the others. That's kind of driving the cattle into water and driving the horses into water. So there could be some very old roots to it.
No, and as well, it's spread across Breton country in Scotland as well. It's kind of found in France, it's found in Ireland, it's found in Scotland. So it's, again, like all these things that we'll look at as well, when we talk about them and we focus on the Irish context, we're actually describing the broader European kind of tradition as well, of which these are a part. But
it's hugely important to remember that, actually, because we can always think that the Irish are very unique, but actually we're just part of a larger jigsaw.
A thread on the tapestry. It's like the Largy wrote in Béaloidis in 1932 or 33 or something. He talks about there's a piece he has on the importance of our popular customs and so on, but he says that he refers to the work of the folklore of Ireland society. He says that in saving Ireland's folklore and highlighting it or whatever and honouring, that we do the same for Europe's tradition. So it's kind of, this is one thread and we're doing it with this kind of particular kind of nationalist context in mind, but it's also as part of this broader European thread or this or tapestry as a whole, which we have to kind of always view, because these things, especially when we look at the crops and how the crops were conceived of in tradition, it's all over Europe. The same thing comes up again and again and again and again. But
which is fascinating when we see it, because especially we'll come to the names of the corn and so what, and so on. Just to see the pattern emerge is hugely interesting.
it really is, yeah.
But just to
naked horse whipping is now.
your favourite, Jonny.
Yeah.
So we have a quote here from, this is, I almost feel bad saying where it is just in case I defame anyone, but it's in Swinford, which is obviously just outside Castlebar, which I've often visited and it's a wonderful part of the world.
Too late, there's already.
So we have a reference from the Ordnance Survey. I imagine either the letters or the Ordnance Survey, what do you call them again? The letters and the
Maps.
The maps. So we have a quote here from Mr. Page, and he says, "The people, it is said, swim their horses in the lake on that day to defend them against incidental evils during the year, and throw spancels and halters into it, which they leave there on the occasion. They are also accustomed to throw butter into it," this being the lake or the river, "with the intention that their cows may be sufficiently productive of milk and butter during the year. The clod emma, or lump of butter, thrown in at a time, does not be more than 1/4 pound in weight. After the crowds have gone away, the poor, who have not the necessaries of life, otherwise than by obtaining them, by alms from liberal or charitable persons, assemble and carry off as much of the butter as they can gather out of the lake."
Out of the lake, that is grim.
That is grim.
That's really interesting though. Yeah.
So that is from Mayo. I'm sorry, Mayo.
That's quite alright, Mayo. No, sure.
They've got great footballers.
One of the things with there's a supplementary kind of piece to this that Maura McNeil writes later on about ritual horse bathing at harvest time, and she finds a few more examples of the same. But for some reason, which she asked herself at the end of this piece, it seemed to survive more in the Midlands, and without knowing quite why. So there's plenty of intriguing, kind of strange aspects to maybe something that was a particularly old custom that only small kind of vestiges of remain, which is interesting in and of itself. Of why would other aspects surrounding the harvest have kind of, again, made the jump into more contemporary periods, whereas this seems to be. I mean, I wonder if it's practiced at all today. I wouldn't imagine so.
I've never heard of it. If you know that it is practiced, yes, exactly. Jonny would love to know.
Yes, indeed, yes. But there's a piece here from in this regard about the riding of horses into the sea in a state of undress, and this is a magistrate in County Clare in 1833, and they're kind of writing, again we see like officialdom, who's kind of interfering or intervening or whatever with these customs, and they describe the disgraceful practice of bathing on the strand of Kilkee at all hours of the day, to the great annoyance of females who are by such indecent exposures prevented from exercising on the beach. And it describes that eventually this magistrate, they banned men from this particular beach because at this time they were riding their horses into the sea and causing consternation.
To the females.
To the females and to the judge, it would seem.
The judge was clearly a man. Had he asked a woman, I'm sure the females would have had no problem.
He might well have just wanted to join in himself and felt bad that he couldn't. But there are instances of these from like I was saying, from similar expressions in France, in the Breton peoples, and so a kind of an example of a tradition of the old Celtic world, it would seem, that fits in again with these kind of this harvest time, Garland Sunday, Lunacy celebrations. A curious and interesting one, but
really curious. And I suppose just to finish up in terms of the celebrations and the activities carried out at this period of time, the fairs, it's also worth mentioning just for the sake of completeness. So we should differentiate between an Ina and an Ina. So it's Aonach and Oenach, so we have the very old Ina, Oenach, which would be that of Telltown, and which is a kind of a unitive religious, political and social assembly. And then to differentiate that with the modern Ina, or the kind of the fairs, which is more economic with the buying and the selling. But as you said, the 1st of August being a quarter day, it would be very common to have a fair in the main townlands for the very practical reason, not only of buying and selling, but also of hiring workers and labourers for the harvest ahead. So this is where the kind of the spalpini come in, and we have, I suppose everyone knows about the poem and spalpin faina, the kind of migrant workers, and we see them across Europe. We see kind of many Irishmen in England, and they used to start the harvest in Cheshire in the south of England and actually follow the harvest up to Dumfriesshire in Scotland, which we will come to this, because I wonder what role that would have played in taking some of the traditions that we had there and bringing them back.
that's a very, very good point. Yeah, no doubt.
I'm not just here for jazz hands,
Oh,
Jonny.
sure, look, that's a really good point. Yeah, of course. Again, when travel and stuff is limited, that I hadn't thought about that. That you'd have then these people moving to these other portions and districts of the country or other countries, and then travelling forth and bringing back these customs. Yeah.
So just so the fairs would be hugely important. One of the most, I suppose, well known would be the Puck Fair in Kilorglin in Kerry, which celebrates the goat is king, and which is what's lovely about that. Apparently, the storyteller Sean O'Connell from Ballish and the Skellig in Kerry, he said, and I don't know if this is true, but in recollections it said that the only time he ever left his home was to travel to the Puck Fair, and he only had the train fare to get there, and he had to walk the 20 miles back.
Oh my God.
Isn't that? So I don't know if that's true or not. I add a disclaimer, but I just love the idea of that. And as a final point, because I'm always quite aware that we do a lot of the rural, and I know one of our loyal listeners is keen to hear more of the urban, which we will do in subsequent podcasts. But in Dublin, Cork and Galway, 3 of our major cities, there was actually a very active kind of celebration at this time as well, or kind of period of activity. In Dublin, we have references to what is called the riding of the franchises, which I don't know if you've heard about this as a Dubliner. I hadn't. So it would be a parade where the tradesmen would, I suppose, display and kind of or have representations of their trade, and then they would have someone representing their patron saints with them walking through the streets. So you'd have the tanners and the blacksmiths and various spinners and whatnot, and then you'd have the different patrons, which I don't have with me on this page, which is unfortunate because they name all the patron saints, the Saint Loy, Saint Crispin, and each one had their patron saint, and this would happen as a kind of triennial procession, apparently called the Riding of the Franchises. And in Cork and Galway they would have something similar where they would do something special or particular on the 1st of August or the Sundays before or just after, where they would elect mayors or something in recognition that this was an important time, not only for the Gaelic world, so to speak, out in rural Ireland, but also in the urban as well.
Like it's a kind of economic time for economic concern. This is like the kind of the hiring fairs that you mentioned for the May Day kind of customs as well, I suppose, where people are they're gonna have this period now that begins, and you're going to be off with the farmer or whoever if you're in the countryside with that.
Exactly.
That's interesting. I'd never heard of that in Dublin at all.
So it's good to remember the urban, because there's always folklore there
Absolutely.
as well.
But yeah, I suppose after kind of the Garland Sunday observances and all the joy of and celebrating and climbing mountains and eating berries and so on,
They have to get to work.
they have to get to work. Yeah, and this is again, but it points to like what you were saying earlier on there about the communal nature of this, that it's men and women going to the fields and their children, all hands on deck basically to cut the corn, the rye, the oats, the wheat, the barley that was there. There's a description here from a fellow in Mick O'Toole in County Mayo, and he's describing the scythe that was being used to cut hay. So I mean, nowadays when we look at a field being harvested, often you just have kind of, I don't know, one machine or two machines traveling around. I mean, even fields that are it's all automated. So the kind of focus is on, it's viewed in purely, I don't know, it's kind of just empty material concerns where everything's mass produced and here's one machine. It's just turned into a factory.
Yeah,
basically.
there's no human element.
Whereas you have to, I suppose, consider or imagine the period when, you know, in these kind of long evenings out in the morning, or these kind of long days and so on, people would go out to the fields in the morning and they'd be cutting side by side, working alongside. They'd be talking, they'd be telling stories, and they'd be out together, basically working there. You know, that there'd be the noise of these sickles and scythes as they were hacking away. One of them in the tapes that would play describing that they'd be cutting, they'd be saying like the ringing of a bell as they're going through all the corn or whatever. But it was quite a kind of rare thing for the whole community to get together and for men and women to join in this work as one kind of unit. You know.
I have a little poem here actually that Roddy the Rover published in 1936 in the Irish Press, which it goes as follows: 4 sharp sides sweeping, in concert keeping the rich robed meadows broad bosom over, 4 strong men mowing, with bright health glowing, a long green sward spread each man before. That's
beautiful. That's brilliant. There's a description here of the scythe that was being used to cut the hay, which we'll have a go of.
Most of the hay was cut here in my young days with the scythe, the ordinary scythe. And you see the tops of the grass beginning to turn ripen. You get into it in with your scythe and mow it out. You would never dig up your measure. No. I used to have all my hay saved about the second week of July, raked up and tied out for the winter. And then you was, around the middle of September, you had 6 or 8 inches of after grass again coming up for the cows to eat.
Delighted with his work.
Absolutely.
Rubbing it in for his neighbours.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. There's there's another piece of the play where he describes the day's work, and it's slightly unreal because just the amount he's describing, getting up at, say, 6 in the morning, you're out in the boat, you're pulling up pots, lobster pots, and you're kind of fishing away, then you're back in by 10, then it's up to the fields, and you're kind of cutting through all cutting the hay and all. So play this just as a description, and he gives out, he's like, we weren't in bed sleeping.
You had a long day, people wasn't in bed sleeping. They'd be out on the bay at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they'd be coming back in about 10. Then you would have a bit of a snack and take your scythe and let into the field of hay, sharpen your scythe. And you could hear that scythe going through it like the ring of a bell. And you'd have a rood of hay cut down a couple of hours. You'd throw the scythe away if you would, and you'd take your old pike and turn it over, shake it out and leave it there. Go off then in the evening, lift your pots, set them again, come back again at the dusk of the evening, take your hay rake and go along it and windrow the hay up in rows. To be drying for the night.
My God,
that was work. And when you come in the next day for your pot, you had only to turn that hay over again with the pike, and it was saved and dry. It was as green as you'd be inclined to eat yourself, and the lovely smell that was coming from it.
That was a long day.
Wasn't it a long day?
Incredibly
Yeah.
hard work.
You can imagine the kind of the quiet pride, if you had the time, that you'd take in seeing all the kind of the field laid out so neatly, but just the amount of work, as he describes, out at 6 in the morning and then from dusk and then back out again, you know, between fishing and then cutting the hay. And there's just work is to be done. There's no kind of, like he says, no, people weren't in bed sleeping, you know.
No time for sleeping.
No time for sleeping, yeah.
was we have some recollections actually in one of the scrapbooks that we're working to categorize, where they're speaking about in the north of Ireland there were a number of people who had been sent to prison for various reasons during kind of various uprisings, and they're speaking about their neighbours actually coming to help taking their harvest, which is lovely, and it's that sense of long days, but you wouldn't mind doing it for others, this kind of communal social sense of everyone helping one another.
Yeah, that was a kind of rural, I guess, cooperative labour where I have my field and everyone comes out and gives a hand, and then vice versa. That it's kind of, I guess it shows kind of an actual community that kind of get together and work together, basically. We'll
come to the idea of competition though shortly, but on the whole though there is that sense of cooperation.
A communal kind of cooperation that occurs, and the mowing as well, you mentioned kind of there's the scythe, and before that there's the sickle that was used to cut these crops. So it wasn't a kind of mechanised or industrialised process at that stage, basically, but that again was people working side by side. And there was the idea of certain customs that certain individuals were credited with a kind of charm, a supernatural charm, that they'd have this really sharp edge all the time to the sickle or to the scythe. They'd have edge charm on the ear, so that you'd write this charm down, you'd sew it into the clothes you were wearing, and that you'd never have to stop and sharpen your instrument. Yeah, whereas somebody with some piece of rubber scythe, or who didn't have the benefit of this charm, kept having to stop and to sharpen it in a certain way, and that they'd be kind of dragging and killing themselves, pulling their way through the grass. Whereas this person who had the charm would just be kind of casually mowing through enormous kind of amounts or whatever. There's another description here on how to sharpen the scythe, but also a kind of story that this individual has. This is Michael O'Brien, on a good mower and a bad mower. There's a story where he describes this woman has two men out working for her in the field, and one of them, as he walks up, he cuts all of the hay and he cuts all the corn in one go, and he walks back without doing anything because he's done it all. Whereas the other guy walks back and he's not great. So when he comes back, he's still cutting.
I see.
But she takes the bad mower. She looks and he's like, "Oh look, you're cutting it only one way up. He's cutting it up and back."
Tell us about the scythes now. There was a great art in keeping your scythe sharp, wasn't there?
You know to know the way to sharpen. If you couldn't sharpen, you couldn't cut. You killed yourself cutting. Destroy all of you.
Was there? What was the knack in it now?
You need to know the way to sharpen, just the same as sharpening a knife there. If you didn't know the way to rub her down right, you could rub away there and you should never be sharp.
Some men couldn't.
And then you no bother mowing. If you could sharpen it, you just run his
Very easy to
just
swing.
only handle on the side, just like that, back and forth. Another man, he would have no edge on, he'd be pulling her through it like that. And how much yelling and the swept on them.
Did you ever cut corn?
Like the two old boys that went away to cut, these two boys was cutting for this woman, you see. And the one of them a real good mower. Oh Lord, they could have just walked along like that, you know, just the same as going to town and down the footrock. This other boy, he wasn't too good a mower and he was missing half it, and when he was coming back again, you see, you mowed away that length away on as far as you could, and then you turn back and you come back and start to mow the same road again. And this man, he was always coming back with his scythe and his shoulder to start, and the other boy, he was coming back in the sway they had to mow, he was backing away at mowing it again. The woman was watching at them and going in for their dinner. She says to she says, "One of you men will do me," she says, from this on. She says, "I see this man," she says, "he mows back and forth," she says, "and you come walking back," she says, "you're only mowing the one way," she says, "you go home," she says, "I'll keep this man," and he could mow no one.
You'd be hopeless.
And the man that could mow well, he got the road.
But
for he was coming walking back again.
there was
It's good, isn't it?
That's great.
Yeah, but yeah, you can imagine the total difference, and the opportunities it would kind of provide as well. And it's one of the lovely customs that appeared as well, and that seems to be a kind of a borrowing from our sister island over in Britain, and that has a particular kind of provenance or occurs particularly in the north of Ireland, is the harvest knot, which is a beautiful little kind of custom, I suppose. These were kind of given back and forth as love tokens between men and women working in the fields, and that you take these wisps of straw, small kind of knots of straw, or 3 of them together, say, and plait them over one another, tightly over one another, so that you have this little kind of plaited loop, or these little loops with the grain attached to them, that would then be worn on on your button or whatever like that.
They're beautiful. They're so ornate. We're actually sitting looking at one right now.
We have one on the desk as our symbol for all these podcasts. It's a lovely one. But I'll put some photographs up or links to photographs in the description for the podcast and SoundCloud that people can look below and see examples of them. In England, some of them in particular are absolutely beautiful and really ornate. But as customs generally, they're quite kind of, it's a simple process, but they're kind of tricky to make as well. Kind of finicky little things to construct.
They are. They look very. I think they look easier than they probably are.
They're quite kind of delicate things. There's a piece here. Where is this now?
And they would make them for. Each one would be different for the male and the female.
Yeah, the female ones would have. The ones worn by females would have the grain still attached, and then the ones worn by males are kind of simpler. The grain is shorn away, so it's just the 3 little stalks and the loop.
Oh, I see.
So I guess there's an aspect of kind of femininity and masculinity present in the two of them. There was a piece regarding these by T.G.F. Patterson wrote these about customs and harvest customs in Armagh. A lovely kind of article giving all the different details. But one of the accounts, he described seeing this young fellow wearing a harvest knot and commenting on it to him and saying, "Oh, this is beautiful, this harvest knot. Kind of where did you get that?" And he said, "Oh, his sister made it." And this author then found out where this young man lived, and he was speaking to him later on. He said, "I must knock over to your house to get your sister to make me one of these harvest knots." At which point he said the young man became greatly confused and very nervous, and finally admitted the poor that a girl made it or gave it to him.
Ah, bless.
So he was obviously terribly shy or nervous about this thing, whatever. But they were typically kind of exchanged in this way because, again, it was an opportunity when men and women from around the community and from further afield in different places were working in the fields, working side by side, that this is the kind of natural thing that these would be exchanged. It was a broader kind of communal type of work that was kind of quite rare, really, as opposed to, right, men work here, women work here, and we're just on the home or on our own land or wherever. And now people get to go further afield, and that's the kind of the type of thing that manifested at this time. They exist in Irish tradition, but they seem to be a borrowing from English tradition, and particularly have great profusion in the north. Like I was saying, they exist in greater instances up in the north. But like I said, I'll put pictures in the description to see some of the examples, because they're beautiful things to behold, really, really lovely to look at.
They are.
But I suppose after the kind of the main kind of work of the harvest had been done by even coming towards the end of September, there was, I guess, the focus changed onto the cutting of the last sheaf, which is the kind of huge symbolic kind of ceremonial ritual aspect to it all over Europe, and of particular antiquity, it seems, as well, where as the crops were being kind of gathered in and cut, the last bundle of corn standing in the field, it was ceremonially kind of cut. It wasn't just cut and like the rest of them, and then there was no kind of, it was a specific kind of point, I suppose, and sometimes people would kind of stop before the cutting of this last sheaf, and they'd cut it in a particular way. So men and women were free to join in. They'd throw their sickles at. They'd stand back, and they'd throw their sickles at it to cut the last sheaf. Sometimes the last sheaf as well was plaited. It was plaited so that it would kind of look quite ornate in and of itself. But there's an enormous amount of different kind of aspects of belief and material in this regard.
One of the things I read, which I thought was funny, although there was an aspect of wanting to be the one to cut it, but then also we'll come to certain areas looked upon it as kind of an omen of bad luck. But I read about one farmer who apparently used to bury or kind of almost obscure a little patch of hay so that he could always be the last one to have it, to do the last sheaf, whereas someone in the top right corner might say, right, we've mowed it all, so here's the last sheaf, and they would cut it. But Boyo in the bottom left corner would be like, oh no, this is actually, I'll have the last sheaf. Isn't that so funny that they've actually it was such a part of the custom that they went to those lengths.
This is here's the same fellow who was talking about sharpening the side and the good, more and bad. Mick O'Brien, he mentions the cailleach and the cutting of it.
Did you ever hear tell of the at the end of a harvest, the last stick of corn that was being cut, there was a ceremony about it? Come to the end of the field.
They had a big harvest dance and everything that night, maybe, in the house.
Aye.
My house or your house or wherever it was.
But did you ever hear that there was a hare in the...
In the last sheaf, when they were winding and she went out and away she went. if she didn't get caught with a scythe.
Did you ever hear a name for the last sheaf? Did they call it the last sheaf just?
The last sheaf.
The Cailleach? You never heard it called the Cailleach?
Callia. Something like that was right. The Callia. And then they used to have big lunch spreadings and everything, and they would have danced there in the house that night. There would be a dance.
Tell us about the dance. What would that be like?
There would be a dance. It would be the same as giving harvest thanks in the church there. So they would get danced and all.
The farmer would give a dance?
The farmer would have a dance in his own house.
And what do you...
Might be in the kitchen, or he might have a barn, he'd have it in the barn.
What music would he?
All the boys would be gathered around, and there'd be some couple of boys with a couple of violins, and they would give them the music all night.
Would there be whiskey there?
There'd be a drop of whiskey, or maybe a drop of this boy we were talking about, poitin.
Big celebration.
Why?
That was the harvest time with the cutting of the last sheaf. But there's a few kind of, I suppose, worthwhile things that are mentioned there. Where the collector there, Seamus O'Connor, who's the former director of the National Folklore Collection here, he asked, was there ever a hare in it? And he also, and so there's a reference to an animal, and then there's also a description of it as the Cailleach.
That's true.
Which means kind of the old wife, the hag, or the granny, which are other terms that were used to describe the last sheaf. And it was also described then as the maiden, the queen, sometimes as well. So you have this kind of, this aspect where, I suppose the idea where the corn or the crop is personified by a spirit who is a nature spirit, who's kind of conceived of generally as a female, either as a maiden or as a mother. This is the case all over Europe, in Germany, in France, in the kind of Slavonic countries, in Scandinavia. You find this again and again and again. The idea of the corn mother, the rye mother, the barley mother, or and in Irish tradition, like we're describing there, it's the Cailleach. It's kind of this old woman, basically, who is the personification of a generalized kind of corn spirit, basically. And that in the last cutting of this sheaf, sometimes the corn mother or the Cailleach or whoever across Europe, sometimes she's caught with celebration, sometimes the idea is that she's killed, or that she's kind of taken away, and so on and so forth. And that it's essentially, I suppose, the idea is that she exists wherever corn is being cut, so that when the crop was kind of cut and the last sheaf was ceremonially cut, the Cailleach or the hare or whatever, the idea was that this spirit then went to the next field where they were still cutting, and it would carry on like this until it was until all these kind of had been cut, basically. Because
they would often say that, wouldn't they? We're sending you the hare,
we're
sending you the Cailleach. They would shout it across the field.
And that it was a kind of, and that was kind of done in a mocking or derisive tone, where it meant you're being slightly lazy, or we're better than you. We've finished our work and you're still toiling at it. There's a description in George Fraser's The Golden Bough where he describes beliefs in this regard across Europe, but he talks about in Wales. There's a particularly kind of good instance where he describes that the mower who's managed to kind of cut this last sheaf takes it and very kind of clandestinely goes to the neighbours, the next field where they're still working. But if anyone suspects his visit or sees him coming and they know he's working over those other fields, they'll unceremonially kind of tell him to get the hell out of here, basically. Right. So we'd have to creep up behind a bush or down by some kind of gap in a fence or something like that and see who's mowing and throw the last sheaf at them, see if they can hit them, but just basically put this on them.
Okay.
So that they now have the old woman, basically. And that the idea is this has to be, you can't be the last person with it. In some instances it was said that you then had to feed this old woman, that there was a famine in the farm and you had to feed her for the year. Yeah. So that again, there's a treatment of it with kind of with reverie, with celebration, also with distrust, but the idea that there's a generalized kind of nature spirit, which is an embodiment of this kind of, I suppose, natural aspect or embodiment of a particular realm of nature that manifests in the crops all over Germany. I mean, if the wind would blow in parts of Germany across a wheat field, it'd be said, oh, there goes the corn mother, or the corn mother can be seen, and there she is in the field or whatever. So you have this dual aspect of femininity as well, where sometimes she's the maiden, sometimes she's the hag or the granny. Sometimes you'd have a last sheaf made to look like a kind of as though there's a little person inside a big person, that there's a kind of, the maiden is inside the granny or something, that there's the grain that has newly ripened and given us kind of sustenance and has sustained us and will keep us alive for this year, and then there's the grain yet to ripen to bring kind of sustenance and abundance into the future, and profusion and all these kind of things. that there's that aspect of kind of femininity, I suppose, that's symbolised in
fertility,
and fertility, that comes into these things and these basic concerns. And Fraser makes note as well of the sense that when you look at how these kind of expressions manifest, they're open to all people. So it's not a priestly class who practice them. They're not these kind of propitiatory rites. They're magic rituals where you or I or anyone young or old can engage in these certain practices, and that they're not linked to a deity, that the individual attached isn't a deity in the sense of how a god might have a certain name like Lu or like Dionysus or something like that in Greek tradition, that it's the corn mother. That's wherever there's corn, there is the corn mother. It's a general kind of nature spirit that's being worshipped. So in that sense, on account of the generalized sense of it and the kind of the context in which these rituals are practiced, not by a priestly class or an elite of the society, he describes them as particularly ancient and quite primitive. But you can imagine fields all over Europe, from, like I was saying, from Germany, France, England, Ireland, Poland, Scandinavia, all across, that this same conception of the corn being personified as female, as this kind of mother figure or a maiden figure that was bringing sustenance and providing sustenance, and who is embodied in the last sheaf, which is treated with a kind of reverie when it was cut, but then also with this kind of, it's put onto the next field as a kind of, you don't want to be the last person with it, basically. And there's mention by Fraser as well of dousing it with water, which he describes as a rain charm, or the person who cut it with water. That this kind of these, and that's very common in Ireland and England as well. Or sometimes whiskey was thrown on the person who managed to cut it. Sometimes it was put round the neck of the person who managed to cut it, and they were dragged home, and they'd have a big party and so on.
It was almost apparently again, it's that idea of a stable tradition, but variable across regions. So that sometimes was put around the neck of the person who cut it, or the owner of the field, or his wife, almost as a noose, as in not in a properly threatening manner, more in a light-hearted way, but as in, it won't come off until you pay us or you feed us at the end of the harvest.
And that was the harvest home then, where the farmer would kind of buy that back. They'd pay. So those who had been working the farm would be treated to this kind of giant party, and then, or a giant feast, and then more broadly the community might be treated to a broader party of kind of singing and dancing and music and so on and so forth. But yeah, I suppose that idea of the kind of the femininity of it, the symbolic aspect of it, and it's the kind of the last thing that's then cut. But it's a hugely common, and again, actually in England there are more examples, at least that I've seen, of these really beautifully ornate the last sheaf, sometimes called the Queen or the Corn Dolly or the Kern or the Churn in England as well, the CHIRN, which is from the Old English for corn, as opposed to the churn used for the implement used to churn butter, to churn milk to make butter. The churn in relation to this, where you see it, is more related to the idea of the corn, this grain. But from like I was saying, from Greece all over Europe, Eastern Europe, Northwestern Europe, into Scandinavia and so on, these practices are particularly archaic, are particularly popular.
And what we should also mention is the last sheaf as a weapon, or to use it in curse making, to curse your enemy. And we've come across this before, which is a very dark side to folk tradition, which we see from time to time. But that if you stole the last sheaf, that someone, because obviously they would bring the last sheaf to the house of the owner, and it would often stay there for the celebration of the harvest home, and sometimes they would actually keep it for the year until the following harvest. So you'd see instances of the last sheaf being held in the house and being hung above the door, and you might see a few of them. They have lovely descriptions of this golden sheaf, and numerous examples across are in a certain room. But the worst thing was, if you stole this last sheaf, you could actually use it to harm your enemy who had scorned you in love or underplayed you in a business deal. And how it worked was, you gave the last sheaf the name of your enemy, and then you would bury it. And as the last sheaf rotted in the ground, so too would the health of your enemy decline. And we have awful recollections in the archive of people actually going back to where they buried it and watering it so as to make it rot quicker, or sticking pins in certain joints of the last sheaf to represent the joints of the person, to inflict more pain as their health declined. And then thankfully there was a method of reversing this. We have a story about a priest who's brought in to kind of find out what is wrong with this person who's suffering severely, and they discover that he or she's been cursed, and he goes to the family who's done it and demands that they rectify the situation. So they dig up the last sheaf and dry it by the fire, and the process of drying it apparently reverses or was believed to reverse the curse, and the person regained health, thankfully. But there is that darker undertone, isn't there, to folk tradition?
It's not uncommon, that idea, that last sheaf being used. There's a piece I dragged out from the tapes in the archive here, Mrs. Annie Lynch, and she's describing exactly as you've described it there, a sheaf buried with pins in it to attack. She says, if I had a spite on you, that this is what you do. And that other instances where sometimes they're found in sand pits or dug up, and they're like, ooh, you just suddenly found that someone has it in for you, whatever. But that was the only way apparently that it could be cured. If you dig it up, then it could be broken. But she also makes an interesting point that she says that when the pins and things would be in, as it was buried, you'd be getting increasingly ill and sick, but you'd have no symptoms, no pain, so you wouldn't know what was the matter with you at all. Here's this piece, an interview with her.
Then they used to put down the sheaf too, didn't they?
Oh, that's only when they didn't like do that. They'd get a sheaf of corn. And,
Would it be a full sheaf?
well, I suppose it was supposed to be, but sure, there might be a small one, I don't know. You'd get it, and if I had a spite to you and I said, but look at me, I'd finish him off, and I'd get this sheaf and I'd take it home with me, and you had to stick a pin in every, them, where the joint. Aye. Stick pins through all them in the sheaf, and then tie it up again and go to some old boggy place that it wouldn't be long rotten. I heard him saying he seen one of them dug up in a sand pit somewhere, but it didn't rot. If corn as it would be rotten, you'd be getting some disease and fading off without pain or ache. You wouldn't know the hell what would be on you. No one would know. Doctor couldn't find out what would be on you.
Was there any remedy against that?
Oh, I don't know. Unless it was lifted or someone you wouldn't do it up. I think not. I think once it was down for you, once your name was on it, it's last year. Once your name was on it, it was the last year.
I think it was gone.
Once your name was on it,
That was the last year. It's dark, isn't it?
you had it.
That's it. Yeah, you're kind of symbolically imbued, and that's the kind of a very fundamental idea, the notion of sympathetic magic, that you take this kind of item and you imbue it with some essential kind of characteristic or symbolic essence of the individual that you want to attack or cause benefit to, or yourself or whatever, and that you cause change in this item, in this case the sheaf, and it will cause change in the intended victim, in this case your enemy. So as the sheaf rots, your enemy gets sick. Same principle, people will be generally familiar with the voodoo doll idea, where I put a pin into this effigy and someone else feels the pain. That's the idea of sympathetic magic at a very basic level. But yeah, the last sheaf had that kind of element to it where it could be used to cause damage and destruction.
And it was also used for divination, as many festivals they have that element. But there was the idea of the first woman to enter a house beneath the sheaf, her name would be the farmer's future wife's name, or they would grains taken from the last sheaf and put under a pillow that you would dream of your future spouse. So there's that element of, as with kind of that Halloween and May Day, that is a period of time where divination is very popular.
Yeah, that reference to wedding divination, I've heard that a few times before. And there were other instances I've come across where the sheaf, if it was placed on water, it could find a drowned body. If someone was drowned, that this would be placed on the surface of the lake or whatever, and it would kind of float off and rest over the body of the drowned person. So it have these kind of strange secondary properties again. And it shows as well, as we were saying in the last edition of the podcast with vernacular architecture, that material culture and the material items from the natural world often reveal more about our kind of spiritual beliefs and symbolic things than the more abstract expressions like storytelling kind of customs. It's when we deal with objects and the secondary, the dual meaning that objects have, where on the one hand pieces of corn or crops or whatever are just natural items, and on the other hand they can be used in all these different ways. The last sheaf was used in Sweden and Denmark. I think there's the Yule boar, I could be wrong with this, where the grain from the last sheaf was baked into a cake that rests on the table for the entirety of the period of Yule, which is the kind of pre-Christian, the pagan winter festivity that becomes kind of Christmas or whatever. and that the grain mixed into this was kind of, again, would appear in this cake. But the idea of the last sheaf being represented as an animal as well is particularly common. So again, in the same extent all over Europe, you have, apart from it being known as the corn mother or this female, the crop and the corn in general was understood as an animal. That, I suppose, it could be that even the last sheaf, as it was being kind of gathered up, when it was cut, animals would often
they
come
would
running out of
retreat, wouldn't they, to that final place?
Exactly, yeah. As everyone's kind of mowing through the field, they would gradually be kind of being pushed into a certain corner, so that when that was cut, a hare might dash out, or a bird might fly out, or whatever particular animal it was. But there's a huge amount of different animals. There's wolves, dogs, horses, all the strange kind of sounding animals to us that you wouldn't have roving around free in these kind of fields nowadays. But again, it seems a reference to the antiquity of this tradition, that in older periods of time you would have had these different types of animals
roaming more freely.
Roaming around. And in the same sense that sometimes in parts of Germany and so on, when the wind is seen to kind of blow across a wheat field, it was said there's the corn mother. It was sometimes also said there's the corn wolf is moving through. I remember reading an instance from England where a mower who was having difficulty mowing, or who was particularly lazy, they'd say that the white dog has him, or that the dog has walked past him. That the spirit of the corn has somehow afflicted and affected this mower. But again, in the same sense that when the last sheaf was cut, this corn spirit would transform itself into an animal, and it would flee to the next site where corn was still being cut, and onto the next field until it was captured and done. And that's why in our tradition, apart from it being called the cailleach, when the cailleach was cut, the cry would often go out to the next field over, still working, we sent you the hare. And that is the idea of that I suppose even the idea of transformation from one thing to another was kind of common as a belief for our forebears and our ancestors, and that in their view, when this thing was cut, well, a bird has flown out, and now that bird embodies the spirit of the corn. So it's an animal all over Europe, in the same sense that it's regarded as kind of dual femininity and this nature spirit. It also often takes the form of an animal in this way. And then again, that even finds itself, as I was describing, in this cake that's baked at Yule. The Yule boar is then made from the last sheaf. Or that the last sheaf then often would be kind of, like you're saying, hung up in the house, or grain would be given to livestock, or would be kind of used in their foods to promote health and strength and kind of well-being in a generalized sense, I suppose. But yeah, the last sheaf is kind of has these aspects of femininity, or as this kind of anthropomorphic kind of component to it, and then it's often held up in the house and kind of kept there, snug above the door while the year goes ahead until the next harvest comes around. This is the basic idea. Yeah.
It's interesting though, isn't it? It's just, and there's so much literature that we'd recommend you jump in and explore it for yourself, or to pop in and visit us, because as you said, it tells us so much about our beliefs and customs. You can read as many stories as you like, but actually when you see the tangible, it brings it so much more vividly to life in many ways.
It really does, yeah. And these are the kind of customs that were maintained by our forebears for countless generations, and it links us back not just into a closer kind of recognition or closer contact with our own cultural inheritance and tradition, but the broader European tradition of which we're all a part, in which many ways it seems so strangely alien to us nowadays, where these things would be kind of removed, or we're removed from them almost. We're not aware of these very kind of basic and old ideas. But by going to this material, the traditional material, either in literature, or like you're saying, to visit us, or to visit the archive and to come through the manuscripts here,
or to
and
pop
the audio
onto
recordings,
Doochas.ie as well.
That's another perfect way to do it. If you go to Doochas.ie, Duchas.ie, and you could enter a keyword search, enter last sheaf, or the hare or something, and you'll get thousands and thousands of stories like this. One of
the poignant things that actually you said during the week that really resonated with me, and might be a nice poignant note to end on, is you were speaking about the workers in the fields would often kind of chat as they worked, and then gradually, as kind of more kind of industrialization came in and the tools changed from the sickle to the side to the kind of the modern, these huge combine harvesters that we see now, that one man either that you were speaking to or that you'd read was saying that once the machines started coming in, they found it difficult to speak to one another because they couldn't hear one another, and then eventually they stopped speaking, which I just think, given that we are very romantic in our nature sometimes here, is just such a representation of where we are sometimes.
Decay and degeneracy.
Exactly. We've just stopped talking and listening to each other.
I was chatting to a friend of mine, but it was something that he'd read, but it was a description of two men describing the tractor as it first came in, and they're kind of cutting the corn through this, I think, and that they couldn't hear each other over the engine, and so they stopped telling stories then. And you can imagine as well that it's a place for old people and young people to talk and share, advice or experience, whatever. And now you have one factory roving around in a field with one man in it, if even. You've other just automated kind of systems where it's just this mass-produced economic concern, kind of materialist approach to everything. And you have the secularization of the landscape, the disenchantment of the landscape, where it's just the eye that looks at it, views it purely on economic terms. And not that, that was, obviously it had a kind of great importance for our forebears at an economic level, but it was also underpinned by all this kind of symbolic traditional information, I suppose, that has lent itself to a rich store of custom and tradition, not just the sort that we describe, but also kind of songs and dances.
That's true.
Surrounding the harvest, That
would have gone with it.
Yeah. I'll put up some links again in the description so people can have an idea of where to go or what sort of material is out there. And perhaps it would be a good time to finish with something.
A third treat from the archive?
Yes, indeed.
Lovely.
Yeah. This is a piece of music on Stacking Norna, just a little stack of barley. This dance and songs to accompany it from a lovely event that we put on last year in Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin city centre that had the harvest as its theme and focus. So it was all storytelling, kind of singing and music taken from the harvest tradition. And this is Emmett Gill playing the uilleann pipes and Jesse Smith playing the fiddle. And then the Brooks Academy dancers, Jerry and Anna O'Reilly, and other dancers whose names escape me, I'm afraid, dancing these traditional dances. This is the end of the night, and at this stage I was absolutely delighted with myself. I was so pleased to see this kind of thing come off. It was beautiful. I really, really enjoyed it. But this is this kind of final piece of music in Stacking Norna. And then we'll be back next month. And between now and then, Garland Sunday is almost upon us. The harvest is almost upon us.
It's true.
So climb to your local hilltop.
Gather bilberries.
Ride naked into the sea on a horse.
Do when police are not nearby, because we do not want those kind of claims coming to us, Jonny.
No, we don't. And
but have a wonderful harvest, metaphorically or figuratively, literally. And
And
hope it's successful.
In the meantime, we can enjoy the particular fruits of the harvest that manifest here. In this instance, in that of song. But we shall see you next month.
Take care.
Slán.
We'll just finish with the stacking orn and this little stack of barley. We'll do it the modern way and then the old way.